courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people shuffled into their seats, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Lawrence Whitman barely glanced up from his papers, his fingers drumming against the polished wood of his bench. He had already made up his mind. He always did in cases like this. Another black defendant, another troublemaker who thought she was above the law. He had seen it 100 times before, and to him, this was just another open and shut case. The officers had given their statements. That was all he needed. He adjusted his robe, peering over his glasses at the woman standing at the defendant's table. She was young, early 30s at most, with smooth brown skin and sharp eyes that held a quiet fire. But he didn't care about any of that. All he saw was a woman who didn't know her place. "Miss Johnson," he said, his tone laced with condescension, "I don't have all day. The officers say you resisted arrest, failed to comply, and became aggressive. That's enough for me." A ripple of approval went through the audience, especially from the two officers seated smugly at the plaintiff's table. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a square jaw, smirked and crossed his arms as if daring her to speak. "I'd like to," Olivia began, but the judge cut her off with a wave of his hand. "You'd like to what? Waste this court's time with excuses," he snapped. "Women like you." He let the words hang in the air, his meaning clear. "Always think you're the victim when you're the problem." The words hit like a slap. A few chuckles rose from the courtroom, from people who knew exactly what the judge meant but would never say it out loud. Olivia's jaw clenched, but she stayed composed. She had dealt with men like this before, men who saw her skin before they saw her humanity. The officers exchanged glances, suppressing grins. They had seen it too. This judge was on their side. He always was. That's why they weren't worried. They had done this before, fabricated stories, twisted facts, walked into this very courtroom and left unscathed. Olivia Johnson was just another black woman in a long line of people they had railroaded through the system. One of them leaned over, whispering to the other, his voice just loud enough for Olivia to hear. She should just take her charge and move on. Olivia's fingers curled into a fist at her side, but she exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. She had learned long ago that losing her temper in a place like this would only confirm the narrative they had already written for her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice even, "I'd like the chance to present my side." Judge Whitman rolled his eyes dramatically. "Fine," he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "But keep it brief. I doubt it'll change much." The audience murmured again, some nodding in agreement, others simply waiting for the inevitable. Olivia glanced at the jury. Half of them seemed disengaged, eyes wandering, already convinced of her guilt. The other half looked at her with mild curiosity, as if wondering why she was even trying. She had seen this play out too many times. She knew the odds, and yet she had no intention of letting them write this ending for her. Judge Whitman tapped his gavel once, a lazy motion that barely made a sound. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Before Olivia could speak, one of the officers, Officer Reynolds, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we've already given our statements. The facts are clear. She was uncooperative, refused to provide ID, and became belligerent. We had no choice but to detain her." The judge nodded along, barely listening. "See, Miss Johnson? That's what happens when you don't respect authority." A few heads in the crowd turned toward Olivia, waiting for her to protest. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she studied the judge, watching the way he carried himself with an air of absolute certainty. He had already decided she was guilty before she even stepped foot into this courtroom. That was the way the system worked for people like her. But what Judge Whitman didn't know, what the officers didn't know, was that Olivia Johnson was no ordinary defendant. She smiled, just slightly. "Of course, Your Honor," she said, her tone polite, "but I'd still like to make my statement." The judge sighed again, rubbing his temples. "Fine," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Let's get this over with." The officers sat back in their chairs, looking smug. They had no idea what was coming, but they would. And when they did, everything in that courtroom was about to change. Subscribe for the next part, because this is just getting started. The judge let out an exaggerated sigh, tapping his fingers on the bench as if Olivia Johnson's presence was a mere inconvenience in his otherwise smooth day. The courtroom filled with spectators eager for another predictable ruling, was still buzzing from the judge's earlier dismissal of Olivia's attempt to speak. The two officers, Reynolds and Carter, sat smugly, already seeing this as a win. "You can make your statement, but let's keep it brief, Miss Johnson." "I don't have all day," Judge Whitman said, his voice laced with impatience. Olivia opened her mouth, but before she could get a single word out, Officer Carter scoffed loudly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we've already explained what happened. She refused to comply, she escalated the situation, and she left us with no choice but to detain her." "Exactly," Reynolds added, nodding along. "We were simply doing our job, following protocol. That if Miss Johnson had just listened instead of arguing, we wouldn't be here right now." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Olivia could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. The judge already believed them. The audience had already decided. In their eyes, she wasn't a person standing before them with the right to defend herself. She was a disruption. Judge Whitman sighed again, louder this time, as if her very existence exhausted him. "Miss Johnson, I hope you realize how unnecessary this is. The officer's testimony is clear. I see no reason to waste more time on this." A voice from the audience murmured, "She's just making it worse for herself." Another snickered. Typical. Olivia didn't flinch. She had spent her entire life walking into rooms where people had already decided who she was before she even spoke. But today, they were about to learn. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I find it interesting that I haven't even begun to speak, and yet my defense is already considered a waste of time." Judge Whitman lifted a brow, his expression shifting into something that almost resembled amusement. "Oh? And what exactly do you plan to say that could change anything?" Reynolds leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Let me guess, you're going to say we targeted you?" Carter chuckled. "That we were out to get you for no reason?" Olivia didn't blink. "I was stopped for no reason." Reynolds shook his head. "You refused to provide ID. I was never required to." Carter rolled his eyes. "You got aggressive." I remained calm. The judge raised his hand, his patience running thin. "Enough. I will not have this back and forth nonsense in my courtroom. This isn't a debate. You're here because you failed to comply with the law. I suggest you take responsibility instead of arguing." Olivia's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "That's an interesting choice of words, Your Honor. Comply with the law. I wonder, do you believe the law applies equally to everyone in this room?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone whispered, "She's pushing it." Judge Whitman's face darkened. "Watch yourself, Miss Johnson." Olivia tilted her head slightly. "Or what?" The room tensed. The judge hadn't expected that. The officers hadn't expected that. Olivia's voice remained even, but there was something in her tone, something they couldn't quite place. Whitman straightened in his seat, his authority suddenly feeling questioned in a way he wasn't used to. "I don't take kindly to attitude in my courtroom." "Oh, I'm sure you don't," Olivia said smoothly. "Just like you didn't take kindly to me trying to speak earlier. Just like you didn't take kindly to the idea that I might have a defense." Reynolds scoffed, shifting in his chair. "This is ridiculous. Can we move on?" Judge Whitman was about to agree when Olivia continued, her voice calm but cutting. "I wonder, Your Honor, how many cases like this you've handled. How many times has someone who looks like me stood here and you made up your mind before they ever got a chance to speak?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the spectators who had laughed earlier were now still. The judge's fingers twitched against the bench. "Miss Johnson, I would advise you to stick to the matter at hand." "I am," Olivia said. "The matter at hand is injustice. The matter at hand is the ease with which you dismissed me the moment I walked in. The matter at hand is how two officers who have a history of misconduct, by the way, knew they could sit here and lie to you, and you'd believe them without question." Carter sat up straighter. "That's a serious accusation." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "You'd better watch your mouth." "Oh, now you want to control what I say?" Olivia asked, feigning surprise. "You had no problem talking over me a minute ago." Judge Whitman banged his gavel. "Enough. I will not allow this courtroom to become a circus." Olivia held his gaze, her calmness unsettling. "That depends on you, Your Honor. You can either listen or prove me right." Whitman hesitated, his hands still gripping the gavel. His silence stretched longer than he intended, and it was clear. He didn't know what to do with her. He was used to defendants who cowered, who mumbled apologies, who took their punishment without question. Olivia Johnson was none of those things, and he hated it. "I will remind you that you are here because of your actions, not mine," the judge finally said, his voice lower, controlled. Olivia exhaled softly. "If that were true, Your Honor, you would have let me speak from the start." The courtroom remained deadly silent, all eyes on the judge. A flicker of something crossed his face, anger, frustration, perhaps even doubt. He had lost control of the narrative, and for the first time, he realized it. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Carter frowned. The certainty they had walked in with was slipping little by little, and Olivia knew it. "Proceed," Judge Whitman finally muttered, his voice tight. But it was already too late, because the balance in that courtroom had shifted. The power had started to crack, and Olivia Johnson was just getting started. Subscribe because you won't want to miss what happens next. The two officers sat forward in their chairs, ready to spin their version of the story, their confidence practically oozing from them. Olivia watched them, her face unreadable, but inside she was already bracing herself for what was coming. She had seen this play before. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat and adjusted his tie, sitting up straight as he turned to the jury. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, I have served on the force for 12 years. In that time, I've encountered all kinds of situations, some dangerous, some routine, and some, like this one, where people simply refuse to follow the law." Olivia felt her fingers tighten around the edge of the table, but she remained silent. She already knew where this was going. Reynolds continued, shaking his head as if it was also so exhausting for him. "On the night in question, Officer Carter and I were patrolling the downtown area when we noticed Miss Johnson acting suspiciously." "Suspiciously," Olivia interjected, tilting her head. The judge shot her a warning look. "Miss Johnson, do not interrupt." Olivia let out a slow breath and leaned back slightly. "Of course, Your Honor, I'll wait my turn." Reynolds smirked. "As I was saying, she was loitering near a vehicle that wasn't hers, and when we approached to ask if she needed assistance, she became immediately defensive." "Defensive?" Olivia repeated under her breath, shaking her head. Reynolds ignored her. "When we asked for her identification, she refused. We gave her multiple chances to comply, but instead she raised her voice, accused us of targeting her, and ultimately forced us to restrain her for our own safety and hers." Carter, who had been sitting quietly until now, decided it was his turn to chime in. "She kept saying things like, 'You have no right to stop me,' and 'This is harassment.' Typical stuff. But the fact is, when an officer gives a lawful order, you follow it." The judge nodded along, his face impassive, but his agreement obvious. "And was there any point where Miss Johnson threatened you in any way?" Reynolds nodded, keeping his expression serious. "Absolutely. She stepped toward me aggressively, pointed her finger in my face, and refused to back down." Carter added, "We had no choice but to detain her at that point." The judge hummed, taking notes as if this were all standard procedure. "I see, and she never complied with your requests?" "Not once," Reynolds said smoothly. Olivia let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking her head. Carter turned toward her, his expression smug. "Something funny, Miss Johnson?" She finally looked up at them, her gaze steady. "Just the way you're so comfortable lying under oath." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" Judge Whitman immediately banged his gavel. "Miss Johnson, you will not accuse my officers of perjury in my courtroom without proof." Olivia folded her hands on the table, her expression calm. "Oh, I have proof." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Carter shifted in his seat, glancing at Reynolds, who clenched his jaw. Whitman sighed loudly. "You're testing my patience, Miss Johnson." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "And yet you had all the patience in the world to let them spin their story." The judge's eyes flashed with warning. "I suggest you choose your words carefully." Olivia met his gaze without hesitation. "I always do." The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. The jury members, who had seemed indifferent before, were suddenly more attentive. Even the spectators, who had chuckled at Olivia's expense earlier, were leaning forward. Reynolds tried to regain control of the moment. "Your Honor, this is a waste of time. She's just trying to deflect from the fact that she—" "Deflect?" Olivia cut in smoothly. "No, I'm simply pointing out that what you just described never happened." Carter scoffed. "Oh, really?" "Yes, really," she replied, her tone unwavering. Judge Whitman massaged his temple, clearly frustrated. Miss Johnson, do you have an actual argument to make, or are you just here to antagonize the officers? Oh, I have an argument, she said, her voice deceptively light. And in fact, I have something better than an argument. The judge exhaled sharply. And that is, Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She placed it on the table carefully, then looked back up at the judge. A recording. The room collectively inhaled. Reynolds stiffened. Carter's smug expression dropped. A recording? Judge Whitman repeated, clearly thrown off. Yes, Your Honor, Olivia said. You see, I may have been walking to my car that night, but I wasn't alone. I was on a call when these officers approached me, and my phone was still recording the entire conversation. A beat of silence. Then chaos. The murmurs turned into full-fledged whispers, people craning their necks to get a better view of Olivia's phone. The officers looked at each other, and for the first time, their confidence faltered. Judge Whitman's lips pressed into a thin line. This had better be legitimate, Miss Johnson. Oh, I wouldn't waste the court's time, she said, her fingers tapping the screen. Shall we? Before anyone could protest, she hit play. The audio filled the courtroom, the voices of the officers clear as day. Why are you stopping me? Olivia's voice was heard asking. No need for questions, just give us your ID, came Reynolds' voice. You don't have the right to... We can do whatever we need to. Now, stop resisting. I'm not resisting. A scuffle. A harsh voice. Shut up and put your hands behind your back. Silence. Then Olivia's voice, strained but firm. I'm a U.S. attorney. You're making a big mistake. A curse from one of the officers. Static. Then nothing. The room was deathly silent. Reynolds' face was red, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Carter looked pale. Judge Whitman's fingers twinged on the gavel. He looked between Olivia and the officers, his brain struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding in front of him. Olivia leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Now, Your Honor, she said, her voice quiet but powerful, would you like to hear what actually happened that night? Nobody spoke. Because, for the first time in this trial, the truth had taken center stage. Subscribe, because this is far from over. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Every eye was locked onto Olivia as if she had just shattered the very foundation this place was built on. The audio still echoed in their minds, proof that the officers had lied, that they had abused their authority, that they had been caught. Reynolds shifted in his seat, his face turning redder by the second. Carter swallowed hard, trying to keep his expression neutral, but it was too late. They had both lost the confidence they walked in with. Judge Whitman's knuckles were white as he gripped the gavel, his face unreadable. But Olivia saw it, the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers twitched. He was cornered and he hated it. Finally, he cleared his throat, but his voice wasn't as steady as before. Miss Johnson, this recording is undeniable evidence, Olivia finished for him. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The spectators, who had once chuckled at her expense, were now staring in stunned silence. The jury, who had seemed indifferent before, was now fully engaged. Judge Whitman exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. Miss Johnson, I will remind you that this is my courtroom, and you do not interrupt me. And I will remind you that this is my life, and I won't let it be railroaded. Olivia shot back. The judge's face twitched. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. Reynolds leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. Your Honor, this recording, who's to say it wasn't altered? We live in an age where anyone can doctor audio to make it sound. Olivia let out a sharp laugh, cutting him off. That's your defense? That I somehow manipulated my own voice in real time while being harassed by 2 officers? Carter sat up straighter, grabbing onto the lifeline Reynolds had thrown. Exactly. Who's to say this isn't some kind of setup? Olivia smirked. Oh, I thought you said I was the aggressive one. Now I suddenly had the time and technical skills to create a fake recording while you were busy slamming me against a car? The courtroom buzzed with whispers again. Carter looked at Reynolds for support, but his partner was struggling to keep up. Judge Whitman exhaled sharply. Enough. The court will determine the validity of this evidence. Olivia didn't back down. Oh, you mean like how you determined my guilt before I even spoke? A tense beat. The judge's jaw clenched. Watch yourself. No, Your Honor, Olivia said, her voice unwavering. You watch yourself. The murmur in the courtroom turned into outright shock. Even the stenographer, who had been dutifully typing every word, hesitated, glancing up in disbelief. Judge Whitman's nostrils flared, but he had no immediate response. He had spent his entire career controlling the narrative, keeping people like Olivia in check, making sure they knew their place. But Olivia didn't play by his rules. Reynolds, still desperately trying to salvage what little ground they had left, turned back to the judge. Your Honor, we shouldn't be entertaining this nonsense. This woman is making a mockery of this courtroom. Olivia arched an eyebrow. You mean by proving the truth? Carter scoffed, shaking his head. Give me a break. Oh, I'd love to, Olivia said. But I was too busy getting unlawfully detained. The audience chuckled. Just a little, but it was enough. The tides were turning. Judge Whitman knew it. He could feel it slipping through his fingers. Miss Johnson, he said, his voice tight, I strongly suggest you conduct yourself with more respect. Olivia leaned forward. Funny, I was going to suggest the same thing to you. More whispers. A nervous chuckle from somewhere in the back. Carter rubbed his temple. This is ridiculous. What's ridiculous? Olivia said, her voice sharper now, is that you two thought you could get away with this, that you believed no one would question you, that you assumed I'd just accept whatever charges you threw at me. Reynolds crossed his arms. We did our job. You abused your power. Carter clenched his jaw. We don't have to sit here and listen to... Oh, but I had to sit there and take it when you shoved me against a car? Olivia fired back. Another silence. The weight of the truth pressed down on them. There was no easy way out of this anymore. Judge Whitman tapped his fingers against the bench. He was calculating, trying to find an escape route, but none existed. The evidence was damning. The courtroom was against him, and most of all, Olivia wasn't backing down. His voice, when he finally spoke, was lower, forced. Miss Johnson, I will review this recording. Olivia tilted her head. Oh? And then what? What happens when you hear exactly what I just played? What happens when you realize that these officers, your officers, lied under oath? Reynolds' face darkened. Now wait, No, Olivia snapped. You wait. The entire courtroom held its breath. You wait, she repeated, her voice slow and deliberate, because for once you're not in control. For once you're the ones being questioned. For once the truth isn't something you can bend to fit your story. Carter's hands curled into fists. You think you're so smart, don't you? Olivia smiled. No. I know I am. The judge ran a hand down his face. He was out of options. He had no choice. Bailiff, he said finally, his voice strained, take the recording into evidence. The bailiff hesitated for just a second, long enough for everyone to realize what had just happened. Then he stepped forward, collected Olivia's phone, and the case shifted. The officers were no longer the ones holding the power. Olivia was. And the look in her eyes told them all, she wasn't done yet. Subscribe, because this is far from over. The courtroom had changed. The power that once belonged to the officers, the judge, the system itself, Olivia had taken it back, and now there was no going back. Judge Whitman sat stiffly behind his bench, his face carefully composed, but Olivia could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly against the gavel as if itching to use it. He was losing control of the room, and he knew it. Reynolds and Carter sat frozen, their confidence shattered, their defense crumbling around them. The recording had done what Olivia needed it to do. It turned the room against them. They were no longer the unquestionable authority. They were suspects. The bailiff carefully placed Olivia's phone into an evidence bag, the rustling of the plastic the only sound in the courtroom. The weight of what had just happened still hung thick in the air, pressing down on everyone. Judge Whitman exhaled slowly, forcing his voice into something neutral. Miss Johnson, this recording will be reviewed and authenticated. If it is legitimate... Oh, there's no if, Olivia interrupted, her voice steady. You heard it. Everyone here heard it. His eyes snapped to her, flashing with barely concealed irritation. I will not allow you to dictate how this courtroom operates. Olivia smiled, but it wasn't friendly. And I will not allow you to bury the truth. A murmur spread through the audience again. The power shift was undeniable now. The judge could feel it, but more importantly, so could Reynolds and Carter. They were no longer officers protecting the community in the eyes of the jury. They were men desperately trying to escape the consequences of their own actions. Reynolds, still clinging to whatever scraps of authority he could muster, scoffed. This is absurd. We're being treated like criminals for doing our jobs. Olivia turned her gaze to him, tilting her head slightly. Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Reynolds, not to harass and detain innocent people because you assume they don't belong in a certain neighborhood. Carter leaned forward, his frustration boiling over. We don't assume anything. We act based on suspicion and training. Olivia's expression remained unchanged. And tell me, Officer Carter, what exactly made me suspicious that night? Carter hesitated, glancing toward Reynolds as if searching for backup. Olivia pressed on, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Was it my clothing? The way I walked? Or was it just the color of my skin? Silence. Carter clenched his jaw. That's not what this is about. Oh, but it is, Olivia said, her voice never rising, never wavering. Because if I had been a white woman standing next to that car, you wouldn't have stopped me. You wouldn't have demanded my ID. You wouldn't have slammed me against the car and handcuffed me before I had the chance to explain who I was. Carter's face darkened, his fingers curling into fists. We had reason to believe. No, Olivia cut him off. You had an excuse. Another ripple of murmurs. Judge Whitman rapped his gavel. Enough! This is not a debate on policing methods. This is a court of law. Olivia turned back to the judge. Exactly. So why don't we focus on the law? He narrowed his eyes. Meaning? Olivia leaned forward, meaning these officers lied under oath, meaning they unlawfully detained me, meaning they violated my civil rights. And last I checked, perjury and misconduct are very real crimes. A heavy pause. Reynolds' face turned an even deeper shade of red. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious. Judge Whitman massaged his temple. Miss Johnson, you are here as a defendant, not a prosecutor. Olivia's smile returned. And yet, it seems I'm the only one presenting actual evidence. The judge's lips thinned. He knew he was trapped. If he dismissed Olivia's claims now, if he ignored the undeniable recording, it would be obvious that this courtroom wasn't about justice. It was about control. And control was already slipping through his fingers. Reynolds and Carter shifted uncomfortably, and Olivia could see it in their eyes now. The realization that this wasn't going away. That the usual tricks, the usual biases weren't going to save them this time. The judge exhaled, tapping his fingers against the bench before speaking, his voice tight. This court will take the necessary steps to investigate the actions of the officers in question. Olivia arched an eyebrow. How convenient. His eyes snapped to her. Do not test me, Miss Johnson. She didn't look away. I don't need to. The test is for you, Your Honor. The test is for this entire system. A tense beat. Then the judge looked at the jury. Even they weren't neutral anymore. Olivia could see it, the doubt, the shift in perspective. They had walked in ready to believe whatever the officers said. But now they had heard the truth. And the truth was powerful. Judge Whitman let out a long breath. This court is adjourned for today. Further proceedings will be scheduled. The gavel came down, but Olivia wasn't finished. As people began to rise from their seats, as the officers tried to compose themselves, as the judge prepared to escape into his chambers, Olivia stood. I'll be filing formal complaints with Internal Affairs, she announced, her voice carrying over the chatter. And I'll be making sure that these officers face real consequences. Because this, she gestured around the courtroom, this isn't just about me. This is about every person who never got to prove their innocence because they didn't have a recording. Every person whose life was ruined because no one believed them over a badge. The audience stilled, listening. Reynolds looked away. Carter clenched his jaw. And Judge Whitman, for once, had nothing to say. Olivia took one last look around the room, her eyes lingering on the officers before turning toward the door. She walked out, not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as something more dangerous to the system. A woman who refused to be silenced. Justice wasn't given today, but it was demanded, and that was only the beginning.